Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight for this talk with Matt Ritchie on To Build a Broch. Matt is Forestry Land Scotland archaeologist, where he's worked for the last 14 years in a whole host of archaeological projects pertaining to Scotland's woodlands. And I know Matt from several years ago. I think we perhaps first met at the Strathire Broch reconstruction. I think that was around about 2017, perhaps, actually, when we were there travelling down perhaps to take part in the Broch Symposium. I can't quite remember, but we met there and we got chatting, and we've chatted about Brochs ever since, and it's been good. So when Matt reached out to discuss the To Build a Broch project, his latest publication, I was delighted because his previous work, which perhaps some of you have seen, which includes the outdoor archaeological learning resource, to the more recently the A Song in Stone outdoor archaeological resource, all about learning about archaeology and about prehistory outdoors. And they're really brilliant publications. Would recommend you get your hands on them if you can. I'm sure Matt will tell you a bit more about that in due course as well. So if I could ask you all to just mute yourself just while Matt's chatting, that would be great. But in the meantime, Matt, just take it away, I think.
Thank you very much. So I'm not going to be speaking for too long, but lots of questions at the end, not a problem. It's probably about half an hour. So I'm Matt Ritchie. I'm the Forestry and Land Scotland archaeologist. We manage Scotland's National Forest estate on behalf of Scottish ministers and the people of Scotland. So around about 9% of the land mass, so it's a fair amount of archaeology, and I provide advice and guidance on its management to 5 regions that undertake the majority of the land management on the estate. To keep myself sane, I've got a nice sideline now in outdoor archaeological learning resources, where I'll talk a little bit about them before getting stuck into the meat of today's topic, which is all about the development of the new one, which will be undertaken in partnership with AOC and the Caithness Broch project. So unfortunately, I've not quite worked out how to share the screen and keep my camera on at the same time. My camera switches off automatically. So I'm going to share my screen. Shout out if you got any questions during it, or if I've gone or connection's broken, I will be back. Just tell me that something's happened. I'm going to share my screen now and then probably disappear. Window. Oh no, hang on. Oh yes, it's there. There we are. How's that? Can everybody see that? Kenny, can you see that?
Yeah, I can see it fine.
Good, brilliant. So To Build a Broch is the latest in a series of publications from Forestry and Land Scotland that take a creative and imaginative approach to outdoor archaeological learning. The booklets present some quite complex and unconventional ideas and use archaeological discussion, creative indoor activities, and practical outdoor learning to imagine ancient landscapes, explore today's historic environment, and understand contemporary archaeological methodology. Each booklet is both reference material and learning resource. They use a popular communication style and bold design to align an archaeological and ecological ethos with a more subtle message of stewardship and responsibility. They're intended to share and shape values across a wide readership while rewarding engaged practitioners with accessible background information, unconventional ideas to share with their learners, and exceptional artwork and design. My interest in Brochs, or Forestry and Land Scotland's interest in Brochs, is all rooted in our management of Castle Grugaig that you can see there, situated on the shores of Loch Alsh near Skye, a really special monument with all the various structural components of a Broch that you could possibly wish for. This was the first of my photographs taken with my new toy, a drone, which has just revolutionized fieldwork for me in terms of getting that extra special angle on sites that we're managing. So the booklets that we're talking about are a result of many different contributions and collaborations from a range of professions, including foresters, ecologists, archaeologists, dendrochronologists, educators, artists, and photographers, all working together to present a fresh take on the interpretation of our ancient past and contemporary archaeological science. The booklets are aimed at teachers, youth group leaders, archaeological educators, and anyone really who's interested in our natural and cultural heritage. Into the Wild Woods describes the lives of the Mesolithic wild harvesters. Rooted in an ecological understanding of place and time, the booklet explores the roles of interconnected habitats, natural resources, and seasonal change. The First Foresters describes the lives of the Neolithic pioneers who followed long after, and uses today's native woodlands to explore our human response to trees and woodland. The booklet steps beyond the familiar stone circles of Scotland's prehistory to describe the archaeology of our lost timber halls and fine timber monuments. A Song in Stone celebrates Scotland's internationally significant outdoor gallery of Atlantic rock art and the shared cultural tradition that it represents. The booklet uses an inspirational blend of objective recording, subjective analysis, and narrative interpretation to encourage critical thinking and the creative arts. And finally, dendrochronology explores the science and methodology of tree ring dating, presenting activities that range from measuring a core sample to building a classroom timeline of over 1,000 years. So brochs are often described as icons of Scotland's prehistory, the celebrated cover stars of our past. But have archaeologists created an accessible icon where the broch builders matter as much as the brochs that they built? Were brochs built by the community, a shared building tradition similar to a barn raising? Were they guided by specialist broch builders who had all the requisite engineering and masonry skills? And who commissioned them and why? So to build a broch, the learning resource, is a work in progress, and I'm only presenting the early stages of its development tonight. But the booklet will not be a definitive study of brochs or their material culture. It will not attempt to rewrite the history of broch studies or contain a gazetteer of sites to visit. Readers are encouraged to find their own. It will not explore the fascinating wider context of the Iron Age in Scotland, of Celts and Romans, natives and invaders, which is all admirably dealt with by others elsewhere. Instead, we will step back in time to describe the building of a broch in stone and timber and focus on today's archaeological recording techniques and heritage conservation practice. Using a series of interlinked sections, we will combine fictional voices of the past with contemporary voices from the heritage sector and encourage the learner to read the ruins for themselves. Using the booklets, learners will appreciate three interlinked themes that run through broch studies: the archaeological, structural, and conservation narratives. The archaeological narrative considers the construction of a broch and aims to get the reader thinking about how they were built and who built them and why. It's the imaginative aspect. The structural narrative encourages the reader to consider the stone monuments that they see today in terms of the various components that make up a broch, the architecture and engineering, the processes of ruination and decay, and the material that is missing from the picture. And finally, the conservation narrative describes more recent and contemporary interventions, such as structural consolidation, archaeological excavation, and digital documentation. So the booklet imagines the building of a broch, describing the process with an illustrated narrative and populated with a cast of authentic characters. It assumes that brochs were domestic structures constructed by experienced builders commissioned by well-to-do, productive households, likely in relatively stable times of plenty when they had the agricultural surplus and the resources to devote to building elaborate, high-status display architecture. However, although perhaps the most likely, it must be remembered that this is only one possible scenario. For decades, archaeologists have discussed Broch architecture, creating structural typologies and arguing about nomenclature, categorizing and recategorizing their various features. But there is no standard Broch, no Broch blueprint. Brochs were a diverse collection of distinctive structural components present in different ways in individual sites. Even among the best preserved Broch towers, notes Ian Armitt, no two are exactly alike in size, design, or layout. So the booklet describes these structural components that you see here on the right and aims to help the reader read the ruin for themselves. I hope you like my recreation of an I Spy book, certainly for my generation, a classic holiday reading with a fine photograph of Duncarlowy by Hamish, who I see is on the call here. To help imagine the building of a Broch and the structural components involved, artist Alan Braby has created our core set of construction illustrations. The main theme of this reconstruction series is of circular dry stone building. Broch builders knew their maths and were fantastic engineers, and it is clear that if a Broch was to remain standing, then their internal diameters had to be constant with height, while the external diameter had to reduce with height. Their inner walls rose straight and true, in other words, while the outer walls began thick and tapered in as they rose. Surveys of numerous Brochs, for example, at Castle Grugate, Altbrecht, Clachtall and Duntelve, all indicate their amazing circularity, with variances from a true circle of as little as 10 millimeters. However, we also wanted to emphasize the quantities of stone and timber required, visualized here as ever diminishing piles. The famous double walls, which never have window openings, are knitted together with stone cross ties reaching across and forming galleries. These rise to form tapering towers with individual cells and longer and taller galleries set within the thickness of the outer and inner walls. The circular wall footings can be either solid walled or ground galleried. The iconic Broch of Musa on Shetland stands to a height of 13 meters, but it's very likely that the great majority of Brochs were shorter. The style of wall courses depends on the local stone. Sandstone and schist laminate into long, even slabs and result in neat walls, while gneiss and basalt provide more angular and irregular blocks. Access to the Broch was by an entrance passage, and the door was often set against a rebate or door jamb and barred by a timber that was placed into bar holes on either side of the passage. A guard chamber is commonly found in one side of the entrance passage. The staircase to the upper level usually corkscrews in a clockwise direction between the inner and the outer walls and forms separate stairways that rise from ground floor to first floor and then from first to second levels. Standing within a ruined Broch and looking around the interior, you will see various entrances to the cells, galleries, and staircase. There is also often evidence of a vertical stacked void within the inner wall face, relieving stress within the wall and perhaps providing access to upper levels, and a horizontal scarcement, a stepped ledge likely providing support for a timber floor forming that upper level. The ground floor level of many Brochs is uneven and may have been used like a cellar or a byre. Most Brochs stood in splendid isolation, although some had an additional blockhouse and even surrounding villages of tightly packed cellular buildings enclosed by ramparts and ditches. Brochs were usually built on exposed bedrock using local stone held in place by shape and gravity. They were built on rocky knolls, set against hillsides and placed on coastal cliffs. They were built on the edge of terraces, set back from shorelines, and occasionally placed to occupy whole islands within a loch. Brochs were built to impress. They were display architecture, statements of cultural tradition and social identity, and likely testament to personal ambition and evidence of economic power and reach. The resources, materials, skills, and labour required to build such display architecture were not inconsiderate. Undressed building stone was
Yes,
sourced,
how are you?
while timber. Vancouver, could keep quiet, please. While timber may have been brought from nearby woods or sourced from wooded regions further away. In island locations, the timber resource was restricted and they may have relied on driftwood, although this would be hard to work. A large amount of preparation must have been undertaken beforehand. Stone and timber needed to be gathered, the ground was cleared, and relevant specialists arranged. But where did the labour come from to build a broch, raise a dune, or construct a wheelhouse? In a traditional barn raising, all of the materials required are purchased or provided by the family who will own the barn once it is complete. However, the workforce is provided by the local community with one or more people with prior experience or with the specific specialist skills chosen to lead the project. Older people who have participated in many barn raisings lead their respective teams, while younger people participating for the first time will have watched many barn raisings and know what is expected of them. Only certain specialists are permitted to work on the most critical jobs, such as joinery and the doweling of the beams. At most barn raisings, the community collective has raised barns before and approaches the task with experience both in the individual tasks and in the necessary organisation. It is very likely that Iron Age timber roundhouses were raised in a very similar way, and Atlantic roundhouses may have been no different. The spoken narrative from our broch builder. My broch is my home. It's on an island towards the setting sun, built on a rocky knoll above a wide bay, about 2 days' sail from here with a fair wind. I'm a broch builder, like my father before me and his father before him. We built our broch with thick foundations, and the ready slabs of local stone allowed us to build our walls, tall and tapering. But my men and I use whatever is available, good stone and strong timber. That's all we need. When creating our archaeological narrative, we decided to depict people in a number of different possible roles associated with the broch and surrounding area, and to ensure that we had a good balance between the genders and of young and old people too. However, there are lots of roles we did not illustrate, leaving much space for the imagination. And we present just one model of family life. The nuclear family, consisting of 2 adults and up to 4 children, and the extended family counting up to 10 individuals, writes the archaeologist Julia Koch, comprise a standard demographic model based on cross-cultural studies of agricultural societies. However, these studies are based on ethnographic and historical research, and the family lives of our prehistoric ancestors may have been very different from our own and just as complicated. So our broch family should not be considered definitive. And our assumed social hierarchy describes brochs as commissioned by well-to-do, productive households, where they had that agricultural surplus and resource to devote to building such elaborate, high-status display architecture. Although perhaps again the most likely scenario and easy to imagine, it should also be not considered definitive. Our imagined model allows the supporting archaeology to be readily assimilated into our spoken narratives and visual depictions. For example, the wealth and status of the household is on display in their clothes and jewellery and can be compared to the functional clothing of their retainers or the hard-working leather of the stonemasons. Our page layout is in 4 parts: domestic heading, archaeological quote, spoken narrative, and structural component. Don't try and read this on screen. This is just to show the developing design. The spoken narrative is from Unuist, the father of our productive household. The broch will be finished soon. Urgust, the builder, says that our stones are difficult and cantankerous, but that they'll knit together just fine. He is using the largest blocks to lay to foundations and line the entrance passage, and has already set aside our special lintel stone, ready for lifting into place above our doorway. I'm going to see Craig today about the door. He's our woodsman and is charged with finding the very best timber to split for the floor and roof beams. I want our door to be strong and sturdy, with good oak and iron nails. Our door must be welcoming to guests when open, but quick to close and strong enough to withstand any enemy axe. August has already built a thick door jamb and placed the bar holes for the timber bar into the facing passage walls. Characters like Inuist here are accessible and authentic. They help drive the narrative and inspire a human connection and include elements from the wider Celtic context. Inuist, for example, has a copper broch and torque based on a set found in Old Dearn in the Highlands. Ethne here. The broch will be our home. There will be a warm central hearth built up on a layer of snug stones and clay with peats burning bright into the evening. We'll keep our stores neat with preserves in pots and grains in sacks, all stacked safe and dry. There will be meat and fish hung high in the rafters and butter and cheese in the cellar below. We'll fill our broch with furniture, old and new. Our 2 formal chairs came down to us from a Nuist's family and were carved many years ago. My favourite chest came with me from my family home over the sea. But our children's beds are new, built for me by Craig to celebrate moving into our new home. We'll have tables and benches, bowls and mugs, rugs and furs, and I'll make sure to keep a space for my mother's old loom. We have all we need to spin yarn, weave textiles, and make our clothes. Ethne's outfit here is based on a woman whose body and clothing were preserved in Huldremoss Bog in Denmark and date to around 350 BC. She was wearing a woolen skirt and a top made from a tube of woven wool. Recent work on her clothing revealed that she was wearing a linen undershirt and that her clothing, instead of being brown as it appears after lying in the bog for over 2,000 years, was actually dyed blue and red and was checked. And so, of course, learning from a true master of the art, we also use footnotes to explain key points, because if it's good enough for Terry Pratchett, it's good enough for me. A series of short personal features will enable us to focus on important sites, describe personal experience, or explain archaeological methodology. They can be used as short reading tasks in the classroom, but none of them have been written yet, unfortunately, although my writers are lined up. So I'll demonstrate the technique with a relevant personal feature from a song in stone, one of my own. I love working with artists to imagine life in the past, working out what to include in the image and planning the visual story it will tell. A good archaeological visualization will have a central narrative theme, a composition rooted in archaeological reality, and a creative, engaging style. And although the blend will change depending upon subject matter and artistic style, it's really fun finding that right balance. Archaeological visualizations are an element of heritage interpretation, presenting and explaining information about natural and cultural heritage to an audience. Because interpretation is often most memorable when it is provocative, and it must be accurate and honest to the evidence, but also compelling and interesting, creating links between the audience and the subject matter by stimulating or provoking an emotional response. So some visualizations focus on life inside a historic building or on the clothes that people wore at the time. Some focus on the architecture, on its walls and structures. Some try to set the site within its contemporary landscape. Others illustrate a historical event or an archaeological idea or process. So the same site could be illustrated by a number of different drawings, each showing a different aspect of its history. But each drawing should have an archaeological narrative, a purpose such as a theme to explore or a story to tell. In order to prepare a visualization with an archaeological narrative, the archaeologist and the artist must work together to balance factual understanding and creative engagement. The factual element is educational and informative, using archaeological information and methodology to lead to understanding. The creative element is inspirational and imaginative, using narrative and drama to lead to appreciation. The two elements are often balanced by using a central theme, particularly when describing a historic place or a site. Themes can focus on an event that took place at the site, on the site itself, explaining its construction or architecture, on its setting, showing the site and its wider contemporary landscape, or an idea, explaining an archaeological concept or process. So here you see on the left, the table of bones, where Alan and I depict the process of excarnation, in which the corpses of the dead are left exposed in the open long enough for the flesh to be picked off by scavengers or lost to decay. Once the remains have been reduced to mere bones, the skeleton is gathered up for inhumation in a grave or tomb, or cremation on a funeral pyre. Excarnation is and has been practiced by many cultures around the world, such as the native North American tribes. Exposure to birds is most successful, as the smaller bones are not lost to larger mammals, like those of the hands and feet. Of course, given the intervening millennia, it's just one of a number of intriguing narrative possibilities, and there's no archaeological evidence that rock art panels were used in this way. But we imagine this process being undertaken at the table-like cup and ring marked boulder of Alt a Choi Korenich, which is large and flat and almost altar-like, on the slopes of Ben Laws above Loch Tay. In this case, the boulder and its rock art are very faithful to the accurate archaeological measured drawing. Returning to brochs, they've traditionally been thought to have been built in the last centuries of the first millennium BC and the first few centuries of the first millennium AD, a time span considered quite short in the context of the Iron Age longue durée. Recent excavation at Clachtol, Broch in Ascent, demonstrated construction and occupation in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, a period of over 200 years, with domestic artifactual evidence of only the very final decades of use. Evidence of earlier occupation of the Broch builders themselves had all been cleared away. So brochs were built and occupied, altered and repaired, fell into disuse and were sometimes reoccupied. They stood for centuries or collapsed into ruination to be later robbed for building stone. Clachtol itself burnt to the ground. The ruins that we see today range from great stone mounds showing only brief glimpses of their structural narratives to consolidated ruins held together by introduced mortar and steel bars. And recognizing and appreciating the differences between unconsolidated ruins and consolidated structures that have previously been pinned with small stones, for example, inserted into gaps in the wall faces, pointed for perhaps with lime mortar introduced into gaps within wall faces, mortared, often with cement inserted into voids within wall cores, and supported with steel or bronze bars supporting lintels, for example. Understanding these is an important step towards becoming a Broch investigator. So while we step back in time to describe the building of a Broch in timber and stone, we will also focus on today's archaeological recording techniques and heritage conservation practice. Using a series of interlinked sections, we will combine fictional voices of the past with contemporary voices from the heritage sector of today. A series of short features will explore the conservation narrative, such as the recent consolidation and interpretation of Ousdale Broch by the Caithness Broch project, shown here. From digital documentation and archaeological excavation to conservation management and interpretation, these short features will seek to share and promote the conservation ethos behind our work. So like Alan's fantastic illustration of a wheelhouse in construction, To Build a Broch is still a work in progress to be published next year. But I hope you've enjoyed this quick look behind the scenes and the blend of the archaeological, structural and conservation narratives to be found within. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Alan. That was absolutely fantastic. You managed to put me to total shame by being able to summarise a Broch in about a quarter of the time it takes me to do so in my talks. But that was really great, and you've done so eloquently and rather beautifully, might I add. So that's great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think at this stage, if anyone has any questions, the best thing to do is you can pop them into the chat if you wish, or you can there's an option to raise your hand as well. That's always quite good to do that. Does anyone have any questions that they might like to ask Matt about Brochs, about the publication, about his own experience in creating sort of outdoor archaeological learning publications, or indeed about outdoor archaeological learning? Gavin has a question, so absolutely go for it, Gavin.
I was interested to hear that our staircases generally right-handed, clockwise.
I think so.
Thinking about them, I can't remember seeing one that's anti-clockwise.
From memory, I think what's very interesting is that there's no true corkscrewing staircase. So even at Musa, it starts from a little bit higher off ground level before it goes all the way around. And most brochs have this sort of stop-start tiered staircase from one floor to the next floor with a gap in between. And I think that they are all corkscrewing round in a clockwise direction, which is fascinating and must have implications for how people used the building, and in particular used timber roundhouses, where there's been lots of studies into how they're broken up into different zones of use. So you have your sort of domestic day-to-day use, and then your sleeping area, and it all tends to be much the same. So brochs are maybe similar in that they have these sort of ingrained structural messages or how they're used.
Thanks for that, Gavin. I'm not sure I can add much to the question of whether they're clockwise or not. I noticed that you've got a Kinnaid or a Cainade in there, Matt. Is that, be honest with me, is that named after me? Is that the Gaelic version of me? In your which I believe is the Gaelic version of Kenneth. You can.
It could well be, but the names are all picked by Kim, who helps with the keeps the characters on the straight and narrow. She's very, very good in terms of what kind of clothes people would wear and finding the right objects. So I very much leave character development to Kim Biddulph, who then directs Alex Leonard to draw them. I've then taken their character concepts and try to write narratives for them and put them in the right order within the chronology of building a broch. And only occasionally do I get involved. So that there's a really big chap, Craig, the woodsman, who is, as when you see him, he's absolutely enormous, and he immediately made me think of the Rock. So he had to be a Craig, but otherwise I pretty much leave them to it, and just chip in every suggestions every now and again. With my the Neolithic tribe or Neolithic clan who are in the first Foresters, my only support to the process of character creation was to insist that any bird feathers that they were using had to be capercaillie, because I knew that this would annoy my ecological colleagues, and that was it. Otherwise, leave it to Kim and Alex to sort out.
They're great illustrations. Alex is one of my kind of favourite illustrators, but I would also note that Kinnaid is quite handsome. So I mean, the similarities here are just I know what to believe anyway. But yeah, if anyone has any other questions, please do pop them in.
Just to talk a bit more about the staircase, I believe they are all clockwise helical staircases, and it's possible that it has some relationship to the passage of the sun through the sky. The direction of the entrances tend to face east, so there's possibly some sort of relationship there.
I have to say, probably more likely that the majority of people being right-handed, they just tend to go in a right-handed direction upstairs. It'll be something as simple as that, I'm afraid. Maybe not. But brochs having such small entrance passages.
That wouldn't explain the orientation of entrances.
No, this is very true.
Paul has a question. Go for it, Paul. You might need to unmute. I'm sure it's a very good question if we could hear it, I'm afraid, Paul.
Unmute. There we go. Sorry about that. I always thought spiral staircases went right-handed because when you were fighting, you'd be generally a right-handed person, and you could go down and your right hand would be more free on a right-handed spiral.
Yes, evidence from medieval castles and the likes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'd actually heard that was a myth, a bit of a common misconception. I can't remember where I'd seen or heard that, but don't quote me on it, and I don't have any kind of backing for it at this moment. If anyone has any other questions, by all means, pop them in. I think we had a few in the chat, but I think we were just saying that they're really great, and the characters are great, and they enjoyed it. David, did you put your hand up there?
Yeah, I've got a question. There seems to be a few opinions that people think that brochs are not built for defensive purposes. I don't understand why, since some brochs are done on such defensive sites that they're really difficult to get to, and everyday use would be ridiculous, in my opinion. I guess some have even got like fortified cliff drops down some sides and things. So, but what's everyone's opinion on that? Like, just because there's no weapons found, I hear some people say it wasn't a defensive site, but I think for me, it's evident that it is purely defensive.
I think the best analogy is probably the Scottish Tower House from the sort of 16th century, where they're very much it's a prestige building. It's built to look impressive, but it does obviously have secure defensive purposes. Not if you're besieging it. Probably you wouldn't last long if they set fire to the roof or set fire to the door, etc. But as a secure place to lock the door and sleep soundly at night, it's going to be something about that. Where you have a broch or a dune built in really extreme circumstances, again, it's going to be more about the look of the place and how strong it looks, and that's deemed more valuable than simply placing it somewhere easy to get to, close to water or your agricultural land, for example. So I know what you mean. Some of them really are really difficult to get to, very and very obviously a sort of a defensive stronghold. So there's definitely an element of it within that. But I think in general terms, think of them as prestige buildings.
Because I mean, I've jumped just back from Tidey, and I've been doing the coastal walk there, and I've seen some duns I couldn't get to. It was just dangerous. You would just die. And I've been a rock climber for 12 years. It was so unsafe. I couldn't get to it. Many of the sites have got no pastures within anywhere reasonable, and literally, if it was for imposing, you'd probably put it in a site that would have better view of the landscape so people could see it. Plus, if you're using it as everyday use, you do it on a piece of usable land that's easy to even get to that land and back, or your daily life would be easier. Some are just so horrendous to live in. I can't think of it as an imposing piece or to peacock to the surrounding people that my house is the best. I can't see reason to that.
I know what you mean, and some of them are so exposed to the elements that it really would be unpleasant to live, particularly the coastal dunes. So maybe it's the case that you have one, and as long as you've got one, you can point to it. You actually live elsewhere, but it's a sign of land tenure. It's a symbolic thing, really. I was thinking about the hillfort of Benachie, the Mither Tap on Benachie, which is in Aberdeenshire, is so high that no one would actually live there during the winter. I mean, it would just be horrendous. So I think it's pretty clear that it's there as a ceremonial arena, it's a place where you go to, and whether it's investing the king or whatever the purpose is, you're herding people into an enclosure and then performing whatever ceremony it is, and it's the strength of the hill fort itself that is symbolic. And so perhaps some of these more extreme dunes, and I know what you mean, that the path to get to is just, it could not be a domestic everyday occurrence to be happily traversing that cliff to get to it. But again, it's the Iron Age, and there's lots of interesting things going on in people's heads that we just don't understand.
Our Broch will be much more accessible, hopefully, so we won't try and get you to go along an Indiana Jones style rope bridge or anything like that. Don't worry. Paul, you've got a question as well?
Yeah, one of the Brochs I went to had a triangular lintel, and it said it was quite unique till I went to Clactol Broch and found another triangular lintel. How often are these lintels triangular in the Brochs? How many are there?
I think there's around about 7 from memory, but it's around about that number. And whether it's something structural, there's some debate as to whether the weight above the entrance is then diverted back onto the sides of the doorway. But then you could do that probably with just a very big crossed lintel anyway. So it's probably also something more decorative, perhaps. And I know that I love the triangular lintel, and it's the one at Castle Grugeg. So that's my reason for including it within the booklet so often, is because the Broch that is our remit for really producing the booklet is Castle Grugeg. But there's Clachtall, there's a Coolross, I think is it in Shetland, Donegal up in the far north, and a couple of others I've probably forgotten.
Yes,
but certainly,
when I went to, yeah.
But I think what's fascinating about Brochs is that there's so many of them are just piles of rubble, and quite what interesting structural evidence is in that pile of rubble. It's not that we'll never know, but we don't know for sure at the moment, and it's about imagining how many big triangular lintels are out there, but just lying flat on their face.
I think you're asking for more Broch excavations there. I think that's what you're really suggesting, Matt, which is music to my ears. Let's do one in Caithness. It's been too long. Bob's got a question as well.
Good evening, Matt. How are you?
Hello, not bad, thank you.
Good. Fascinating talk, as always. And absolutely loving Alan Braby's illustrations. They're just so fun. Really, really superb. My question concerns the height of Brochs. Apart from the full height Brochs that we know of, like Musa, Duntrodden, Duntelve, are there any clues around that tell us what the average height of Brochs were? Were some tall and were some squatter? What's your thoughts on that?
It's very much a gut feeling, but I think that the majority are in that middle ground, and they're clearly aiming for height. There are sites like Dun and Reroy near Ullapool, where it's been built on the edge of a cliff, so close to the edge of the cliff that it's actually collapsed over. That cliff seen from afar would have doubled the height of the Brochs. They're clearly going for height, but it's also clearly very difficult to go for height, and many Brochs were perhaps poorly built and fell down pretty quickly. So that there seems to be quite a lot of repair of maintenance. So whether or not, I think Musa is probably the extreme, and that the majority are in the sort of 5 to 6 to 7 meters high, and you're really looking at the imposing nature of that windowless wall in front of you. I also think that I've tended to go with domestic architecture within the booklet because I think that this human nature is that you invest in where you're going to spend most of your time. Cliff top dunes the exception, but most brochs are such an investment in resource that the people who built them are going to want to live there, and that they're going to be well lit. They're going to be with a big hearth in there, and as comfortable as possible. I don't buy anything that you would spend all that time building an austere building that you couldn't actually live in. And so if that means you sacrifice height to get a decent roof on, I think you go with a roof first.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks,
Can I
Bob.
ask a question from Glasgow? Okay. My experience of brochs is much more the brochs in the north, in Orkney, to some extent Caithness, and to some extent Shetland. And I want to pick up on one of the phrases that you've got in your book about the broch builder living 2 days sail away from the broch. And to me, certainly with the northern broch experience, I tend to regard many brochs as brownfield sites, not greenfield sites. So they are things that are built on existing settlements by people who already live there. It's their latest phase of what they're doing to their settlement over several centuries or possibly even millennia. They're not incomers, they're not building on a new site. Now, the comments earlier on about extreme broch positions, obviously there are some greenfield broch sites which people build in dramatic positions for whatever reason. But in most cases, I think it's communities building a broch at whatever point during the life cycle of that settlement position. And they may have lived there for several centuries before, and the community group, the family, may live there for several centuries afterwards. And the broch is just a phase in the site. So I'm just wondering why you wanted to put that phrase in, that I live 2 days sail from where I'm building my broch.
Well, maybe I've not been clear. August, the broch builder, is very definitely the one with the expertise, but he's been brought in to build the broch for Inuit, who's the productive household, who I very much agree with you, has been on that land for a long time, and is now seeking to build the broch for whatever reason that they seek to build the broch. But I very much believe that the structural engineering involved in putting one of these things up is such that you would need, there are going to be specialists out there who are helping communities build them. And so that idea of August saying his broch is built 2 days away by sail is hopefully introducing the idea that Iron Age Atlantic Scotland is a very maritime community, and that just because we haven't found any boats doesn't mean that they didn't have boats. Obviously the timber has gone and we've not spent enough time looking in terms of maritime archaeology underwater. So August has come to build the broch for Inuit, and so I hope you, maybe I didn't express that well enough in the choice of people today, but in the booklet there's going to be 10 sections with 10 individual voices talking about their broch. And in some cases, it's not actually the broch that's being built. So in August's case, his broch is elsewhere, and in Kinnaid, the young warrior's case, it's a broch that he'd like to build. He's dreaming about building nearby. So it's very much a kind of a chronological span of the broch being built and of all the people involved. Does that help?
Yes. Because I sort of agree with you, but I sort of disagree with you as well. In that, to me, a lot of the broch architectures that, in my limited understanding as a non-engineer, is basically a lot of people reinventing the broch concept for themselves. They've realized, they've come across the idea of what a broch is as a big, tall, hunky thing. They've seen one or whatever. and they go back home and they decide they're going to build their own. And it's almost like, I mean, I'm a car anorak, so I know the history of the invention of the car and when people first started building horseless carriages. And there's so much of that in the turn of the sort of 19th, 20th century, is people making horseless carriages for themselves. And some of the people who did that were farm equipment builders, some were bicycle builders, some people were mad inventors. And they all sort of took the concept of taking a carriage, ditching the horse, putting an engine in it, and what they came up with was a whole variety of different solutions to it. And then gradually, some technologies, some devices, some techniques started to predominate. And to me, a lot of it is people wanted to build big, hunky, round things. And
it's definitely a fashion.
Yeah.
And I do agree with you. I think in some cases, people will be trying to do it themselves, and we can see that because some brochs are so badly built. In other cases, they're clearly very, very well built. They've stood for a long time, and I think that the idea of broch building specialists is valid, but it's not valid in every case. So I will definitely try and include that idea within the booklet. I think that what you've got to remember is I'm trying to aim this at teachers, and that they have to have that, is providing them background information with which to use in their own way with their learners. And so I'm trying to go. You try and tell quite a simple story for that to be successful, and that immediate the immediate idea of a broch specialist, a contractor almost, is a very attractive one, and I don't think it can be discounted. But it's certainly, I'm not going to be pushing it as the only explanation, because I think you're quite right. It's such a widespread architectural fashion, and fashions come and go, and I think it's pretty clear that brochs just began to be built. I mean, Andy Heald, my co-author, thinks that this is something around about 350 BC, and that something has happened, and that Iron Age Scotland, particularly in the north, has a response to it. And it's an architectural response, and you can see it in the vitrification of hill forts and other Iron Age. Not exactly mystery, but architectural phenomena. So yeah, it's not a simple picture, but I'm trying to tell a simple story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can follow that. All right, just one final quick point. I picked up as well that you had mentioned very much the different geologies and the different capabilities that the different building rocks allowed you to do. I think I'm very much support that idea, and that whatever broch expertise was emerging, for the sake of argument, in Orkney, it was very much driven by the fact that they had a lovely sandstone to play with, so they could do a lot more experimental architecture than, say, the harder volcanics in the West.
Absolutely. And I think, sorry.
Yeah, one of the other differences, though, is that those rocks have got different properties. The volcanic rocks in the West are much denser, and they're difficult to shape, so they're less versatile, but they're also more robust in terms of being able to absorb the engineering stresses of building a tower. So you end up with a whole different variety of local techniques, which are driven by the geology.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think we've got time for one more question just from Julie there in the chat box, which was amazing project and so well presented, Matt. Are you planning on following up books with outdoor outreach?
Outdoor outreach being Well, I guess that the background to this is that Forestry and Land Scotland and the predecessor organisation Forest Enterprise Scotland always had an interest, along with Forestry Commission Scotland, state forestry, in trying to encourage outdoor learning. And there's a whole series of small groups out there called OWL groups, Outdoor Woodland Learning groups, and they are predominantly there to help train teachers and encourage teachers to get them outside, particularly into woods. Outdoor learning is really, really important. So I picked up that ball and ran with it in terms of outdoor archaeological learning, because it's obviously the idea is to get kids onto a site and thinking about that site, but using archaeological methodology. So it's about recording, it's about observing, it's about analysis, but it's also about interpreting and imagining the past, but using archaeological techniques. So that's the sort of that's embedded, I hope, although I do tend to go off on tangents every now and again, but it's embedded in all of my learning resources. They are then they're badged as OWL Scotland, and they are made available to all outdoor woodland learning groups to give also to hand on to their teachers. So it's a way of distributing them, which distributing to teachers is really hard. It's so the OWL networks and the outdoor learning is crucial, I think, to the success of that more niche outdoor archaeological learning. But in general terms, it's all about the fact that I'm aiming them quite high, because it's for engaged practitioners, people who are already interested in archaeology and history and the outdoors and sort of cultural heritage. So I'm trying to give them high quality information and visuals to use. I'm not aiming for anyone who's not actually that engaged, because I don't think it'll work properly. I aim high with quality, and okay, the results might be smaller in terms of numbers, but I'm trying to help particularly archaeological educators with decent stuff that they can go out and use. So folk like Kenny here is picking them up and using them in classrooms, outdoors, in the museum. They're expensive to produce, but I hope that it's that audience is recipient to them, I think. Yeah. Well, receptive to them. Sorry.
Well, they're well worth it, I think, Matt, because they are pieces of art, is what they are. They're really beautiful, and I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who are making good use of them, and I will be making good use of them in my own role here at Kilmartin. I think, and Julie just wanted to follow that up with saying that sounds great. I didn't know about we don't have woodlands in Orkney, which is tragic.
You've got a wee one. I've been to Orkney. It's just north of Kirkwall. It's very nice.
So I think that's great, Matt. Thank you very much for presenting. That was such a evocative and imaginative presentation, and I think you've summarised the key points of brochs and so well. And that was a real pleasure, I think, for everybody. So I think if we could all give a virtual applause or a real applause, that would be absolutely wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Look forward to working with you on this publication. And
yes.
I'm not sure if you've seen what we're creating, but I think you'll be excited to see what kind of visualizations we've made, and our kind of overall design for our own broch as well. So that might be something that can be included. I don't really know yet, but yeah, look forward to seeing what we can do together. But once again, thank you very much.
Good.
For all those still here, if you want to know more about our project, then visit www.thebrochproject.co.uk, where you can join as a friend, you can donate, you can check out lots of other stuff, and you can check out Matt Ritchie's work on the Forestry Land Scotland website as well. Matt, you might have a little send-off spiel as well if you want to finish off with anything.
No, thank you.
You're good. Excellent. Well, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, everybody, and perhaps we'll see you all again soon. All right. Good night.
Good night.